Good evening and welcome to another edition of Midweek Matters. This week's titled lesson is The True Meaning in Life, and another way of looking at it is the essence of life. What is it all about? We're looking in Ecclesiastes, and one of the things I want to do is go back and look at who wrote Ecclesiastes. King Solomon is given the credit for that. There's three books that basically he's given credit for, and that is Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. And the thing that I found very interesting is starting in today's lesson, it was talking about Solomon and his wisdom. I went back into 1 Kings chapter 3, and this is the time David has passed on and Solomon is becoming king. And in verse 5, we see it says, "In Gibeon the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream at night, and God said, 'Ask what you wish me to give you.' Then Solomon said, 'Thou hast shown great loving kindness to thy servant David my father, according as he walked before thee in truth and righteousness and uprightness of heart toward thee. And thou hast reserved for him this great loving kindness for him.' And it goes on, it says, 'And now, O Lord my God, thou hast made thy servant king in place of my father David. Yet I am but a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in. And thy servant is in the midst of thy people which thou hast chosen, a great people who cannot be numbered or counted for multitude. So give thy servant an understanding heart to judge thy people and to discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of thine?' And it was pleasing in the sight of the Lord that Solomon had asked this thing. God said to him, 'Because you have asked this thing, and have not asked for yourself long life, nor have asked riches for yourself, nor have you asked for yourself the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself discernment to understand justice. Behold, I have done according to you words. Behold, I have given you a wise and discerning heart, so that there has been no one like you before you, nor shall one be like you after you. And I have also given you what you have not asked, both riches and honor.'" So we're seeing a characteristic of God that when we're putting God first and others first, God rewarded Solomon for his lack of selfishness. So we take up today Ecclesiastes. It is said that the word Ecclesiastes means teacher or sermon. It says Solomon, the key verse says, "I know that everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it and nothing taken away from it. God does it so that people will fear him." And again, looking at the word fear, another way of looking at it is reverence. They respect God. And the lesson focuses, seek the true source of satisfaction. The author today goes on and says, Solomon had the means and the intelligence to explore any facet of life. Now, the question I come up, and I found this very humorous, and you find this in 1 Kings chapter 11, to have all this wisdom that he had, I found it humorous that he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. How do you keep all these women satisfied? I had no idea. So that was part of the wisdom I kind of question in. So it goes on, it says, he decided to try to find meaning in life without taking God into consideration. If you were to look at every possible good thing in life and focus on those good things one by one, is it possible to find true satisfaction in life? And as the introduction goes on, it says, and we see this in our society today, it says, football, baseball, the summer and winter Olympics, fishing, motorsports, all kinds of sports are fascinating. People totally dedicate their lives to a single sport. Interviews indicate that some expect to find life fulfillment in their sport. Solomon's advice to them from Ecclesiastes would go something like this. There are many good things in life that are not truly the essence of existence. As you are able, partake in the good things of life, but don't look for the final fulfillment in them. The essence of life is only found in a focus on the things of God. I want to read that again. It says, there are many good things in life that are not truly the essence of existence. As you are able, partake in the good things of life, but don't look for the final fulfillment of them. The essence of life is only found in focus on the things of God. There's a lot of things that I enjoy in life, but when it comes down to it, what is life all about? Going to the beach, going to the mountains. I love travel. I did that the last several years in my job, and I found that I truly enjoyed it, but that wasn't it didn't satisfy me all the time. In section 1, it says teachers should first be taught, and this is Solomon speaking. It says, I, the teacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. I applied my mind to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under the heavens. What a heavy burden God has laid on mankind. I have seen all things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. I said to myself, look, I have increased in wisdom more than anyone who has ruled over Jerusalem before me. I have experienced much of wisdom and knowledge. Then I applied myself to the understanding of wisdom, and also of madness and folly. But I learned that this too is chasing after the wind. You see how he's talking about looking at things, and a lot of times what we're chasing after is like the wind. It comes and goes. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. It tells us that Solomon was the wisest of the wise and decided to search for the meaning of life. Ecclesiastes is his exposition on his findings. He limited search to all that is done under the heavens and all the things that are done under the sun. He confined his search to the heavy burden God has laid upon mankind. He would search through the deeds of men to see if he could find meaning for life without a focus on God. But Solomon couldn't quite leave God out of the equation. God's been here since the beginning of time. As these verses indicate, his final conclusion come in chapters 11 and 12. There is one part of King Solomon's when in Ecclesiastes that I want to take time. It's not in today's lesson, but he gives us a quality of life, and he points out a lot of things, and it's found in chapter 3. It says, there is an appointed time for everything, and there is time for every event under heaven. A time to give birth and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to tear down and a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to throw stones and a time to gather stones. A time to embrace and a time to shun embracing. A time to search and a time to give up as lost. A time to keep and a time to throw away. A time to tear apart and a time to sew together. A time to be silent and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace. And it goes on in verse 9, it says, what profit is there to be a worker from that in which he toils? And we're going to see that in a little bit when he breaks it down not only in section 2 when he's talking about pleasure, and then in section 3 it talks about work. He goes on and says the lesson deals with only 3 areas Solomon explored: wisdom, pleasure, and work. But he discussed other areas in chapters 1 through 10. In chapters 3, he explored life as a kind of treadmill. That's what we just read. He goes on, it says in chapter 4, power and politics, and the every man for himself philosophy of life are considered. Chapter 5 is riches and wealth, or the whoever dies with the most toys wins philosophy. So he covers a lot of thinking throughout the books of Ecclesiastes. It says chapter 7 focuses on the life of posterity. I live for my children. They give me life meaning. Chapter 8 looks at the possibility that being under authority and marching to the leader's drum will give a true meaning of life. Chapter 9 comes to an end of the quest and his failure to find meaning in the things of life. It looks at life itself in contrast to death as a full meaning of life. A live dog trumps a dead lion. His conclusion is echoed again and again throughout the Ecclesiastes. All of these are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. He goes on and says, Solomon was wise, and wisdom is one thing he kept coming back to throughout Ecclesiastes. This was the one thing in Solomon's life that of which there is no doubt, but his continued conclusion was this. Two is a chasing after the wind, for with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. Solomon's downfall was that he was able to see without discerning personal application. He was able to articulate what he had seen, making conclusions without making personal application. Isaiah wrote, "Be ever hearing, but never understanding. Be ever seeing, but never perceiving." And that's found in Isaiah 6:9. The teacher refused to be taught. Goes on, says, since satisfaction in life could be equated with happiness, what would make more sense than to make pleasure the next quest for Solomon's journey? So keep in mind that he's doing a study and looking at Ecclesiastes. This was probably written in his later years after he experienced life as he knows it. Section 2 says, pleasure can be unpleasant. And that's found in Ecclesiastes 2:1-3. I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. But that also proved to be meaningless. Laughter, I said, is madness. And what does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly. My mind still guided me with wisdom. I wanted to see what was good for people to do under the heavens during the few days of their lives. It says, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. This seems like a good plan. If satisfaction is the goal, are pleasure and satisfaction the same thing? While satisfaction might be pleasant, pleasure is the context of something along the line of, if it feels good, do it. That philosophy proved to be meaningless. The writer goes on and says, Solomon saw emotional pleasure throughout laughter. Laughter is purely emotional response, often a folly. In fact, Solomon said laughter is madness. Scholars see the word madness as indicating wild, out of control behavior. After a while, the comedy channel becomes boring and predictable. You know, we can look on TV and it's talking about the comedy channel. And sometimes, you know, the comedy, after you see one routine, it kind of leads to another. And after a while, it becomes mundane. You know, it doesn't satisfy. You know, we all like to have a good laugh. We sit around with our friends and we tell stories of growing up and things that we did, some of the foolishness that we did growing up, you know, and we get a good kick out of it. But, you know, again, like he's talking here, it becomes boring and mundane. People who spend their lives going from emotional high to emotional high find themselves in emotional depths. Pleasure for pleasure's sake is a mirage never reached. What does pleasure accomplish? Besides a pleasant memory of emotion, what has been established by pleasure? Pleasure as the essence of life falls very short. And he asked a question here. He says, Solomon asked, what does pleasure accomplish? How would you answer this question positively? What point was Solomon making? And the writer goes on and says, it makes a person feel good for the moment, leaves good memories. In the long run, pleasure does not accomplish much beyond emotional feeling. It is not the meaning of life. If pleasure for pleasure's sake is not the essence of life, what is the opposite of pleasure? Solomon turned to explore work next. Now, as I've been accused of being a workaholic in my heyday, working all the time and being in retail, it becomes a lifestyle. I can say it has a tendency that when it's all said and done, when I got ready to retire about 2 years ago now, I learned that it hadn't accomplished anything. I looked back at my job and I felt good about it, but it didn't give lasting results. It says work doesn't quite work out as life's essence. And this takes up in verse 10 and 11. It says, I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my labor. And this was the reward for all my toil. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless. A chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. Again, he's looking at another aspect. We go from pleasure to work, and he keeps using the term, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. There was nothing, no permanence. What do workers gain from their toil? I have seen the burden God has laid on the human race. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the human heart. Yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. I know that there is nothing better for people than to be happy and do good while they live, that each of them may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all their toil. This is the gift of God. Verse 14 repeats this, I know that everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it, nothing taken from it. God does it so that people will fear him. Nowadays you have programs on TV about remodeling, and you look at old houses that have been left abandoned for years. And in some cases, those houses eventually go away. And what it's talking about here is God's creation, it endures all time. And the things that we do, we count, what we do for God is the only thing that really will last. It's not the things that, we can have a nice house, we can drive a nice car, we can take care of our family. But when it's all said and done, how we treat others and how we lead others to God is the only thing that truly lasts. Over the weekend, I had the opportunity to be a part of a celebration of life to my son's godfather. And the one thing that kept coming out is, as the ministers were talking, they were talking how Johnny had been involved in their lives, and that in the last couple of years, due to physical limitations, the only thing, every time they talk to Johnny is keep going, keep remembering. Jesus, tell them about Jesus. Jesus is all it is. And I thought about that as I was studying this lesson. Is when time stands still, there's nothing else that's lasted. We even look at Solomon's time. It goes on, and the writer talks about that. The writer goes, I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my labor. There's something exceedingly pleasurable, emotionally and physically, about a job well done. No denying that. The workaholic feels that and then feeds on it until work for work's sake takes control. Solomon had a lot to say about work, but he seemed to say that the reward for all my toil was the delight in the fleeting emotional rather than the physical aspect of work. He goes on and says, his conclusion was that when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. What is left to the great works of Solomon? There are a few stones from the temple he built. He bemoaned the fact that he must leave everything he had toiled for the one who comes after me. That was his son Rehoboam, who destroyed much of what David and Solomon had built. Of course, we have Proverbs, Song of Solomon, and Ecclesiastes, but God's hand and inspiration were in these. There may be good work in because God has made everything beautiful in his time. Work pleasure, and wisdom are not bad or evil things in themselves. They simply cannot stand alone to give life meaning. Within life itself, God gives us a glimpse of heavenly good. He has also set eternity in the human heart, yet no one can fathom what God has done from the beginning to the end. That's found in chapter 3, verse 11. So it is often said that there is a God-shaped void in our hearts of all of us. There is also part of the image of God within us that responds to what is good and feels guilt for which is not godly. Those who respond to the good as if the total essence of life's meaning will be disappointed. James tells us every good and perfect gift is from above, and we find that in James 1:17. Solomon said, I know that there is nothing better for people than to be happy and do good while they live. That each of them may find satisfaction in all their toil. This is the gift of God. It's not saying that work is bad. It's not saying that being happy and pleasure is bad. But what it's saying is those are temporary things. It goes on, it says, all the good things in life come from God, but they are extras. We got to remember that. The things that we enjoy, these are extra. Our houses, our family, our cars, even finances. These are things that came from God. These are the extra things. But it says they are extras, not essence. When the extras of life are grasped as the essence of life, the values vanish. For they are meant to lead us to the essence. The essence is God himself. Everything God does will endure. God does it so that people will fear him. And again, I like to use the word respect. Fear to me leaves a negative being. It's not that we fear God, but we respect him and we reverence him. It says God blesses us with good things in life so we might find the meaning of life which resides in him. And in 1 John 5:12 says, whoever has the Son has life. And it leaves a couple of questions to think about this week. It says, name some of the good extras God has given to you. And he goes on, he says, some of these things might be financial stability, a family, church family, car and housing, things that we've already discussed. And then he asked one, and this calls for a personal response. Have you mistakenly grasped any of these extras as the essence? Have we taken any of these extras that God has given us? Just like when we first started and we went over into 1 Kings chapter 3, and we were talking about Solomon. Solomon said that he wanted to have wisdom, a discerning heart. And God says he was pleased with Solomon's answer. And not only did he give him the wisdom and the discerning heart, but he also gave him riches and things that he didn't even ask for. In closing, it says the good things of life are not always the essence of life. So hopefully we establish that the essence of life is serving God, listening to him, studying his word, living for others instead of for ourselves. Until next week when we look, the title of next week's lesson is Life is Short, and truly that is the truth. Looking back right now, it just seems like yesterday I was starting to work. Now my grandson is starting to work, and I'm retired. So life is just, as Kenny Chesney says it a lot of time, don't blink, because it will pass in a quick manner. Until then, be safe. Have a great week.